Gamers, hello. It's the start of a new year and you kind of know what that means. People are filled with enthusiasm and excitement about their New Year's resolutions. Gyms the world over flood with all these New Year's resolutionists, and then come like mid-February, everyone kind of goes back home and their life resumes as normal. So, this year, I thought I'd do something to help out a little bit. Something that commonly happens towards the end of the year is some people kind of want to change jobs or change industries and whatnot, and I get a lot of people asking for some advice on breaking into the industry, so I thought I would put a small video together and give some tips on interviewing for your first design role in the industry. That said, this video is going to be more of a talky one. I'm going to probably just throw up a bunch of B-roll in the background from games that I've been playing lately that I think are pretty cool. Quick disclaimer, all thoughts and opinions expressed here are my own and do not reflect on my employer. Alright, with that out of the way, let's jump into tip number 1, which is demonstrating your thought process. Design is a bit of a weird discipline because it's hard to tell if something's going to work out or not by just talking about it. That's why a lot of the time you have to prototype something out, play it, and iterate on it before you build the confidence that it's actually going to work. So, when you're in an interview and someone asks you a question, don't just focus on giving a correct answer, and make sure you're also demonstrating the thought process that you've put into that answer as well. And to be honest with you, most of the time that ends up being way more valuable than the correctness of the answer itself. Let's give an example. Let's say you and I are in an interview and I ask you to tell me how you'd make Elden Ring better. Instead of saying something like I'd like to make bow builds more viable, walk the interviewer through the thought process a little bit. You can say something like you've recognized that in a lot of Front Software games it's really difficult or it's even borderline impossible to make a build that purely focuses on that archer fantasy. You could point out that like bows and arrows, crossbows and bolts, they often play a secondary role that more supports a main build rather than being like the stars of the show, which is weird because sorcery exists, right? You could play the game beginning to end and have that ranged combatant experience using sorcery but not using a bow and arrow, and then maybe you could leave it there and just point out that you think through what would need to change about the game to try to make that happen. Now that answer is a bit more verbose, but it does a lot of good things for you. First off, it's pointing out that you understand what a player fantasy is and you're saying you recognize one that's kind of underdeveloped in those games. You're talking about how the crossbow and the bow and arrow have a role already in the game, so it's not too bad, it's not all that bad. And you're drawing a parallel to the sorcery system and kind of hinting that you may not need to change all that much about the way those weapons work to kind of make them work. And I mean, even with all that, the answer was still pretty concise, right? And you do want to watch out for that because you don't want to overcorrect. Because the last thing you want is to be one of those people that thinks out loud and it's very incoherent and difficult to follow. You still want to be pretty concise and just like demonstrate a series of thoughts that connect together decently and not just like word diarrhea all over the place. Which brings us to tip number 2, and that's the difference between a developer and a player. I think it's safe to assume that by the time you walked into your first interview, you've been playing games for a good while. Now you need to be able to talk intelligently about those games. If something is fun and you're having a good time, can you talk about why it's fun? Can you really dive in there and figure out what makes it work? And similarly, if something's not working out well, can you suss that out and try to understand why? Now the good news is you can start to cultivate this sort of like sense pretty early. When you're playing a game and you're having a good time, stop and try to think about why that is. Is it a gun mechanic that just feels really good to shoot? Is it, I don't know, a beat in a story that's been delivered super well? And same thing if you're not having fun. If you're not having a good time, what is it that's going on? What's stopping you from having a good time? And start to think through what needs to change to make it better. And if you wanted to take this even further, it's important to start to think about the different player types that exist out there and how different mechanics might appeal to them. So if you're like me and you're all about mastery, do you understand what sort of mechanics in games appeal to the type of player that you are? And more importantly, can you empathize with different player types? So if someone's a collector or an achiever, do you understand what sort of mechanics go into the game that would appeal to them instead? Now the third tip is make it a conversation, which is less industry specific and more just general good advice for interviewing. A lot of the time in interview situations, there's this awkward back and forth where the interviewer asks a question, the interviewee gives a response, there's a bit of silence, and then there's another question, and there's that back and forth. Now, what you want to try to do is dismantle that a little bit by making it more conversation with the interviewer. And the way you do this is just try to involve them more in the answer that you're giving. Like if you're about to reference a game, ask the interviewer if they've played the game. Maybe even ask them what they think of the game. Towards the end of your answer, you could ask if that makes sense or if you need to elaborate on something. Depending on the scenario, like if things are feeling pretty good, you might be able to like crack a few jokes, right? And the reason you want to do this ultimately is to kind of humanize the situation a bit more, if that makes sense. And it leaves a very good impression on the interviewer because it gives them a sense on what you'd actually be like to work with. Now, with that said, keep in mind, you don't want to force things, right? If you're the sort of person that feels comfortable doing something like this, go ahead and give it a shot. But if you're the sort of person where conversations like these aren't your strong suit, or you don't do particularly well like socializing or making conversation, don't worry about it. Just focus on doing well in the interview. Now, the rest of these tips are a bit more rapid fire, and the next one is say you don't know. So if you're in an interview situation and the interviewer asks you a question and you're having a hard time coming up with an answer, call that out. Tell the interviewer that you might not be familiar with the thing that they're talking about, and then try to give an answer. You never want to just sit there in silence and kind of just say, I don't know, and then not follow it up with anything. But if you call out that you might be particularly familiar with what they're talking about and then try to give an answer anyway, it does a couple of things for you. First off, it gives the interviewer an opportunity to clarify or redirect you towards a different question if they need to. And it demonstrates on your end that you're perfectly okay calling out that you don't know something and that you might need help. And more importantly, that you still give it a shot and still give an answer and not just sit there all flustered. Okay, the next one is going to seem really obvious, but you'd be so surprised how many times I've interviewed people that don't do this, and it's research your employer. Like, you're intending to work in the video game industry. If you're interviewing at a studio, chances are the studio has made some games before. Take some time, play those games, because chances are your interviewer is going to ask you about the games that they've made or a scenario around the games that they've made before. And if you walk into an interview and you've just not bothered look up your employer or research the people that you're about to talk to, or like even play the games that the developer has made before, it doesn't leave a good impression. So yeah, take some time, play some games, and get ready to talk about them. And the last tip for today is be prepared. And there's two sides to it. The first side is try to come up with questions your interviewer is going to ask you and practice coming up with answers. If you have a friend that can do like a back and forth rehearsal with you, that can be really, really helpful. If you don't, just sit down and try to visualize it, try to come up with like questions and answers for yourself. At the very least, it just helps you shake off some like weird jitters early on and just helps you feel a bit more prepared. And at best, you'll actually like preemptively think through some questions and develop some like well thought out answers. And the other side of be prepared is that you should prepare some questions for your interviewer, because chances are at the end of your interview session, the interviewer is going to ask if you have some questions for them, and you want to ask some intelligent ones, right? Don't be one of these people that just ask like, what are the snacks like in the break room, or like something silly like that. Take some time. Ask about the team culture. Ask what your day-to-day life is going to be like over there. Ask them what the ideal candidate is, because at the very least it kind of helps you figure out if you're going to be a good fit. Because at the end of the day, it's as much an opportunity for you to feel out if the studio is the right fit for you as it is for them to like find the right candidate. And that's it. 6 quick tips to help you on your way with your first interview in design. Just a quick refresher. Tip number 1, demonstrate your thought process. Tip number 2, make sure you're cultivating a developer mindset, not just as a player. Number 3, make it a conversation. Number 4, say you don't know. Number 5, research your employer. And number 6, be prepared. Thanks for watching, everyone. I know this video was a little different than the usual sort of videos I do here, so leave me a comment below and let me know if you want to see more things like this, or if you want to see less things like this. I'll totally get it too. But yeah, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.